This directly speaks to individuals who are bearing bad fruit but appear to be a tree that would bear good fruit. And one thing about a tree, what I have in my notes, and it occurred to me, when you have a tree that is going to be bearing fruit, it'll start to have buds on it that'll turn into fruit, for instance, if you want to think of that metaphor. And this takes time. Some trees can look beautiful on the outside in certain seasons. They can have flowers, then it'll turn into fruit, but it takes time. Therefore, if you watch a person just as a tree, you will see the fruit that it bears over time. And sometimes it requires you to cut things away in order to see the fruit that they bear. You can imagine someone taking a ladder and it taking a great effort to go up the ladder into the tree and then cut away the branches in order for those to see the fruit on the outside. That takes time and effort to see that. And to even get to that certain point where you can see the sort of things that the tree is going to produce. I'm just presenting to you the mechanism in which we are habitually submitting ourselves to every day, and we are slowly conditioning ourselves to analyze things and assess situations in mere seconds. And we believe that the value of something is based on its aesthetics. I think this has become the primary mode of how people assess a situation, a person. Think of the dating world on dating profiles. Like I have one. And it's interesting how we believe we can come to a proper realization of who a person is. We can cross reference that with a sort of metaphorical grading sheet and think that we know if that person is going to be good to us based on the sort of profile that someone creates and the pictures they share mostly. I'm sure everyone is familiar with hearing the version or some version of the parable wherein Jesus states that you will know a tree by the fruit that it bears. Everyone has heard a rendition of this, or I think it at least is a sort of story that all of humanity can come to terms with, and we can grasp it in our minds and implement it in the world. Everyone knows of people that they give a good vibe, or the output that they produce is congruent to the positive input that they produce. Therefore, if someone is a good person and authentic, they will produce a change in the environments that they are implemented in a great and positive manner that will also uplift the people that also share the same space as them. Everyone knows of people like that. And on the flip side, people know of individuals who put on a front and they act in a manner that is attractive to those, and so they are able to get into doors that they might not be able to get in based on concrete evidence of their performance in the past, but maybe they're a good talker. And so you can think to yourself that these people are bearing good fruit because their tree is attractive, let's say. But over time, you start to notice certain things, and the tree wasn't what it appeared to be initially. They bear bad fruit. And I've been reading in Matthew chapter 7, this is 15 through 28 is what I'll be going over today. And this comes directly after Matthew chapter 7, verses 13 and 14, which is called the narrow and wide gates. And I spoke on that last week. And the ordering of these verses and these parables is completely intentional. You have to remember that this is the Sermon on the Mount, for those that don't know, and it was a series of parables and teachings given to us by Jesus. And I'm reading this, obviously, as I just said, out of the book of Matthew. And that book is special in itself. I won't go down that rabbit hole, but it is basically, there's a reason why it's the first gospel and the one that was the most popular after Jesus' death there for a while. Because, well, for instance, it contains special verbiage and examples, such as the church. It's the only book in the Bible that uses the term church. That's for a reason. And within this book, you'll find many parables that Jesus spoke within the Sermon on the Mount that are life-changing, and you can extrapolate amazing pieces of wisdom that you can implement into your life. And so to circle back on the narrow and wide gates, why that precedes this teaching is, as I was stating before in the previous lecture last week, there's two ways to live in your life. There's a way where you can walk the narrow path, which is one that isn't commonly traversed. The behavior that people enact while traversing the narrow path will be outside of the norm, outside of the behavior that is found in the common folk. Because in that section, it also states that those who walk the wide path is the path that will then lead those individuals to destruction. But it is the one most commonly enacted. And the verses that I'll read today directly follow this. It speaks on people bearing bad fruit. It speaks on things not being as they appear. It speaks on false prophets. And the last section of it is on the topic of there being two type of builders, wise and the foolish. The wise would obviously be connected to those that walk the narrow path, and the foolish would be those that are connected to individuals who walk the wide path. I'm going to begin by reading verse 15, then I'll just continue all the way to the end of this chapter, which is verse 28, and after which I will share my findings and things that I feel the Holy Spirit led me to. And as always, please share your thoughts and disagreements in the comments. Let me know if this spoke to you anyway, and I am completely open to critique. And I just pray that this would help somebody out there in some manner. So we'll start at verse 15. This section is actually, we'll start at verse 13 so you can see the prologue, I guess I would say. These are the verses that I read last week. This is called the narrow and wide gates. Enter through the narrow gate, for wide is the gate and broad is the road that leads to destruction, and many enter through it. But small is the gate and narrow the road that leads to life, and only a few find it. The next section is titled True and False Prophets. Watch out for false prophets. They come to you in sheep's clothing, but inwardly they are ferocious wolves. By their fruit you will recognize them. Do people pick grapes from thorn bushes, or figs from thistles? Likewise, every good tree bears good fruit, but a bad tree bears bad fruit. A good tree cannot bear bad fruit, and a bad tree cannot bear good fruit. Every tree that does not bear good fruit is cut down and thrown into the fire. Thus, by their fruit, you will recognize them. The next section is called True and False Disciples. Not everyone who says to me, Lord, Lord, will enter the kingdom of heaven, but only the one who does the will of my Father who is in heaven. Many will say to me on that day, Lord, Lord, did we not prophesy in your name, and in your name drive out demons, and in your name perform many miracles? Then I will tell them plainly, I never knew you. Away from me, you evildoers. And then the last section is called The Wise and Foolish Builders. Therefore, everyone who hears these words of mine and puts them into practice is like a wise man who built his house on the rock. The rain came down, the streams rose, and the winds blew and beat against the house. Yet it did not fall because it had its foundations on the rock. But everyone who hears these words of mine and does not put them into practice is like a foolish man who built his house on sand. The rain came down, the streams rose, and the winds blew and beat against the house, and it fell with a great crash. When Jesus had finished saying these things, the crowd were amazed at his teaching, because he has taught as one who had authority and not as their teachers of the law. I love these sections. They speak to things that are completely relevant to us today. And it's amazing how he followed up the section, the narrow and broad gates, with these examples. There's a problem that everyone witnesses today when it comes to how things appear versus the reality of them. And I think this speaks directly to the Christian community today, where we have people who are now labeled as secular Christians. And this is a term that describes what happens when the holiness or original intention of Christianity and the beliefs, practices, commands, and rites therein have been twisted and contorted and influenced by the culture which surrounds them. The way that I would describe it is like in Matthew chapter 7, verses 13 through 14. Those that are walking the narrow path, let's say the narrow path is right beside the broad path. There's like the broad path is here, here's the narrow path. So they can see everything that those traversing the broad path are doing every day and how they appear to be feeling and how they appear to be enjoying their life on the outside. And so the people on the narrow path can start to adopt mannerisms and behaviors and beliefs of those that are traversing this path that leads ultimately to destruction. And over time, those walking the narrow path will then find themselves on the broad path. And this directly speaks to individuals who are bearing bad fruit but appear to be a tree that would bear good fruit. And one thing about a tree, what I have in my notes, and it occurred to me, when you have a tree that is going to be bearing fruit, it'll start to have buds on it that'll turn into fruit, for instance, if you want to think of that metaphor. And this takes time. Some trees can look beautiful on the outside in certain seasons. They can have flowers, then it'll turn into fruit, but it takes time. Therefore, if you watch a person just as a tree, you will see the fruit that it bears over time. And sometimes it requires you to cut things away in order to see the fruit that they bear. You can imagine someone taking a ladder and it taking a great effort to go up the ladder into the tree and then cut away the branches in order for those to see the fruit on the outside. That takes time and effort to see that. And to even get to that certain point where you can see the sort of things that the tree is going to produce. Also, there are other times when you don't know that a fruit which a tree has produced is rotten on the inside until you bite into it or until you peel away the layer of skin on the outside. I'm a big fan of grapefruit, for instance, and sometimes I will cut open a grapefruit and then slice it open, and I'll see on the inside that there's a certain gradient of firmness to the actual substance of the fruit that we eat inside of it. If the fruit inside is not firm, then I know that it has aged somewhat, I believe. I'm not an expert in herbology or anything like that. But I just know that it's not as desirably ripe as I would want it to be when I go to insert it into my mouth and eat it. Therefore, the fruit will not be what it appears on the outside, because I can think before that moment as I'm laying it on my cutting board and cutting it open, and then I pop it open, and then I fold the fruit in half, and I see inside of it. It's not that great. In the same way with people, I guess you can use the example of a knife cutting into a fruit as something akin to an accident happening in someone's life. Sometimes when you watch someone long enough, you don't really know who they truly are until they go through some sort of trial or tribulation in life. Just like a knife cutting through a fruit, that catastrophe or act of nature or moment of weakness in someone that puts on a front, they'll reveal the things that are on the inside, and it'll reveal what type of tree they actually are. Tree. And that's something that's really, I think, lost in a lot of people today, because we are taught to value things based on what we see initially. Think about how social media is constructed and how we are being taught and reprogrammed and conditioned by viewing these shorts of people that they create themselves in their own privacy without us looking, They filter and cut out everything that is non-attractive and doesn't induce a sort of motivation in us in order to put out a product that is alluring and makes someone appear as if they are a tree that produces good fruit no matter the season. All shorts on social media have some sort of attention grabbing aspect to them. You can even think of people putting up content that is tragic. You're pulled to that because you can relate to it in a manner, or you feel sorry for that person. And I'm not saying those things are bad. I'm just presenting to you the mechanism in which we are habitually submitting ourselves to every day, and we are slowly conditioning ourselves to analyze things and assess situations in mere seconds. And we believe that the value of something is based on its aesthetics. And I think this has become the primary mode of how people assess a situation, a person. Think of the dating world on dating profiles. Like I have one. And it's interesting how we believe we can come to a proper realization of who a person is. We can cross reference that with a sort of metaphorical grading sheet and think that we know if that person is going to be good to us based on the sort of profile that someone creates and the pictures they share mostly. We have been completely changed in society to judge a tree by the fruit it bears in a manner that causes us to throw out deeply methodical problem solving. And it may have to do with our attention spans being diminished over time, but we really, really lose out on so much by constantly giving our attention to things that last only a few seconds and allowing this to emotionally manipulate and influence us in a certain way. That's how people can come into your life, traversing this broad path that leads to destruction. And they can appear as someone that you would love to be around, someone you can look up to, and therefore replicate their behavior and mannerisms and adopt some of their beliefs because the fruit that they apparently bear is really ripe and it tastes awesome. And people around them, they want to grab the fruit and eat it, and it will fulfill them. But not everything is always as it seems. Not everything is always as it seems. I would just ask you to think about Jesus' life and how he interacted with the world and people around him, and then go look at the top 5 influencers that you know, whether Christian or non, and think, would Jesus do that? Is that how Jesus interacted with people? Let's say you're not a Christian. You can take the Jesus out of it. Actually, you can just think of Jesus as not being the Son of God, yet he was still somebody that died for people that hated him in order to save them. He went through great trial and suffering. He is the best example that we have of someone traversing the narrow path, whether you're a Christian or not. So just look at him and read the stories in the Bible and think to yourself, are the top 5 influencers that I love? Or no, not maybe the influencers that you love, but the top most popular influencers in a certain area or related to some subject matter that you're interested in or that you know that the common man or woman is interested in. Do they reflect behavior that is selfless to the point where if they knew that nothing they did would garner attention, would they continue doing it in the way that they're doing it? Think about that. And I know it's hard because there's gray areas. Jesus did know the crowd that he was speaking to. He knew how to change his messaging style in accordance to his audience. And so it becomes a slippery slope because, well, let's say as Christians, we agree upon the notion that the most important thing in people's lives is that they become saved and they accept Jesus Christ as their personal savior. If that's true, then shouldn't we do anything in order for that to happen? By any means necessary, we're going to complete this agreement between party A and party B being Jesus, God, Holy Spirit, party A being those that are unsaved. Shouldn't we do that through any means necessary? And I think it really comes to, it's a case by case basis, yet we should not enact things that would cause us to appear to be someone that is traversing the broad path, or someone who is valuing the culture that is outside of us as Christians, things that value instant gratification or selfishness, narcissism, that are masked under the guise of, I'm just creating a standard for others to strive towards. And it's selfless, so don't worry about it. That's not true. And we all know that deep down, I think. And I know it's such a slippery slope. I can think to myself many times when previously in years past, I would see a sermon and everyone would be jumping for joy. And I think they were more enraptured with motivational hysteria than they were the Holy Spirit. I think part of it had to do with the speaker's oratory style, his linguistic ability, and how he could capture a crowd with certain mannerisms and body language. He just had a vibe to him, right? The natural leader. And I would always think to myself, if they are willing to become servants to this sort of messaging in this context here, if this place, even though it's a church, is starting to adopt things that look similar to what things appear in the mainstream culture, wouldn't that weaken their ability to resist things that are not God honoring in mainstream culture? Because if they're starting to develop a passion and love for a certain style of messaging in the church, which should be separate from the behavior that they find in the culture that surrounds it, the culture that we're trying to indoctrinate the Christian faith into, I would say, or implement the Christian faith into. If they're getting used to being okay with that style of messaging, wouldn't that mean their resistance to it outside of the church would be weakened? And over time, I think that would set up people to be okay with implementing even more and more philosophical and cultural values that are found in all of the territories of the enemy of the church, I would say, or of God, things that go directly against God's commandments. And you can find examples of this in the Old Testament, where Moses leads the Israelites out of Egypt, away from the Egyptians. And God's commandment when they get to the promised land is wipe out all the territories around them, like destroy those tribes. And that may seem brutal, and they don't do it. They don't follow through with this. And you can see how this comes back to haunt the Israelites, and it ultimately leads to Jerusalem's destruction. It leads to the influencing of the Christian culture that God was trying to implement through Moses and Aaron initially, and then through the other leaders that came to lead them. It corrupts it because they start adopting the philosophies, the values, and the culture of all the surrounding tribes. Whereas if they would have just wiped them out, if they would have addressed it, it wouldn't have happened. There is something to be said about living a life that sets a standard that is apart from what is popular for the sake of pleasing God rather than for the sake of uplifting yourself. And this creates a sort of standard that is completely different from society, common society, that others, when they become witnesses to it and are presented it, it will stir in them a sort of spiritual revelation that they cannot find in mainstream culture. They will not find while traversing the wide path. There's a section of the Bible that's directly related to properly stewarding the gifts that God gives you. It's First Corinthians chapter 4, I believe it is, and Paul is writing to this church. And within the first verses, he addresses that he doesn't care if other people judge him. He doesn't care about other people's opinions. He doesn't even really care about his own opinion. He knows that God is the one to judge him. He cares about God's opinion. And he essentially states that everyone is going to be held accountable for how they have stewarded and enacted their gifts while here on earth. Everyone is born with a certain set of gifts and a certain set of skills that can be used to further the kingdom here. The life of a Christian is one that embodies and finds joy in suffering, in the trials that God sets before us, and just being able to confront acts of nature and things that happen by chance that God did not do intentionally. They could happen because of our poor enactment of free will that we have by our own choices, or it could be because of the effects from others people's choosing erroneously when it comes to doing X, Y, or Z thing. It's hard to be able to hold your head up while suffering, but that is what the life of a Christian is about. Look at the example of Jesus. So the ability to do that and have faith in God while enduring great suffering and furthering the kingdom for him in a selfless manner, in a way that is apart from what may be popular in your day, out of pure desire to selflessly help others and serve them. That is embodying the practices that Jesus carried out here on earth when he lived his life. And those are the type of things that God will hold you accountable for. And like I said in the previous message last week, I want to go to heaven. And I want there to be a moment where God looks at me and says, "You did good, son. You walked the life in the narrow path. You built your house on the rock, not on sand. The wind blew and the rain came down and your house didn't fall." So I would just encourage you to think about the fruit that you are producing, the fruit that those that you maybe look up to or idolize are producing. Think about maybe taking some time to cut away the branches and the shrubbery in order to properly see the fruit. And if you're starting to question someone's actions, or if the Holy Spirit stirs something in you while you're listening to this, ask God about it. In any of these cases that I just mentioned, ask God about it. Tell him to search your heart, your social connections, the things that you believe are a good standard, that is a good expression of a standard of humanity to strive towards. And ask God if it is pleasing to him, if it is complementary to the calling that you have, which he placed in you upon your creation, and one that will selflessly uplift those around you and further his kingdom for his sake and not your own. It's important to assess a tree by the fruit it bears. And sometimes it's not as simple as just looking at it the same way that we look at a short or a popular clip on social media. So I would encourage you to ask God about that. Ask him to then give you the tools and individuals that you need in order to help solve the problems that are presented to you. And if there happens to be not an obvious problem put in front of you, then I would tell you to ask God for the energy and courage and strength to continue carrying your cross in the manner that will accomplish the purpose and goals that He has placed in your heart to accomplish. Something that's really been prominent in my heart lately, in my mind, is focusing on what God has right in front of me while at the same time focusing on the treasures of heaven. And I like to think about it like this. This just came to me this morning. I think about the work that God has right in front of me that He has placed in my heart to accomplish today as the input, and the output is in the treasures of heaven. And this keeps me safeguarded from falling into the selfish tendencies that I seem to fall into when it comes to helping others, like filling my own cup when my cup represents my ego, or thinking that I am greater than somebody else because they are engaging in some sort of behavior that I used to, but I don't any longer. When I think about things in the world and I'm operating with a focus on them while also considering that God is also watching me, which is kind of the way that I think about treasures in heaven, it keeps me from falling into these selfish patterns of thinking. And it's really, really helpful on a daily basis. I wouldn't say daily, probably, well, daily. Yeah, there's always times when things are not as awesome as I would want them. It helps me to pull myself outside of the scenario and think, if I believed that everything that God has placed in my heart and my mind is actually going to happen and that God can do anything and anything can change it in an instant, how would I operate? How would I conduct myself in this certain scenario right now? And then that's what I do. And on top of that, I basically layer on there that the output that I am to witness based on those actions is going to be in heaven. That is the treasures in heaven. I can't get caught up in what happens down here. I have to analyze the things as a hard worker and as an architect to use the resources that are produced from my actions here in order to further God's kingdom in a selfless manner, but not get caught up in the actual earthly and physical value of them here as we perceive them. Because it's not for the sake of uplifting myself and others in material things, in material ways, I would say. It is for the sake of furthering His kingdom. And that's what I would encourage you all to do. Just think about your life through that lens. Think about the fruit that you are producing and the fruit others are producing. I hope this message spoke to you in some way. If you have any criticisms or feedback or thoughts, please let me know. Please let me know if this did help you. And I hope this reaches you well and that the rest of your week is amazing. I love you and I thank you. And I'll see you next time.